Please welcome Sir Kenneth Brannagh.
Please call me Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for coming.
I love that scene so much. It's, I think everybody from every generation who loves movies can connect with that. But I know that for you, this is a very personal story. And I wonder, if there is anyone here who has not yet seen the film Belfast, can you just take us back to tease a little bit about the fact that your childhood in Belfast was, I'll leave it to you to characterize, but changed on a day, changed forever. Your life changed forever on a day when the people in the United States, a lot of them were at Woodstock, people were having fun. It was a very different situation where you were.
Yeah, I mean, it was what you might characterize as a normal summer's day. It was a hot summer's day. We were aware of news and that it was the summer of love in San Francisco, whatever that meant. I didn't know as a 9-year-old what that meant. Sounded rather exciting. But in Belfast, we knew, we were aware that the civil rights movement had created quite a bit of tension on the streets since about 1966. So again, you're aware of it on television and radio news. But we spent most of our life out on the street. And that's where this particular incident happened for many people in Belfast, particularly North Belfast, on August the 15th of 1969. And it was a moment where our neighborhood, which was a mixed one, Catholic and Protestant neighbors living, mainly Protestant in our street, but I don't know, 2/3 and a third, I suppose, were visited by what in my mind I experienced as the sound of a sort of swarm of bees. That's what it sounded like to me. It was summer, we lived right next to a park, and I couldn't work out what it was, but I'd never heard anything like it before, and I thought it was bees. And then I looked, as I was coming in for my tea, I looked down the end of the street, and I thought, well, is that a swarm of bees? It was about as far away as the back of the auditorium here. And then I realized it was bodies. And then I realized, Christ, whoa, bloody hell. And then I had this sort of surreal 20 seconds where everything in my peripheral vision was going in slow motion, people moving and grabbing people, and then seeing this thing come through the air, and then boom, a big flame as this petrol bomb went off, and not really then knowing what the hell was going on. Suddenly we were in this melee, and out of which I was grabbed by my mother, and for many people, because it was happening in various other parts of the city, it was the beginnings of this very, 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 very dark period indeed in the history of that part of the world that became known as the Troubles. But specifically from our, I would say, harmonious neighborhood. I mean, I was a kid. I was enjoying myself. I played outside. I played with everybody, Catholic, Protestant. It didn't make any difference to me. And it was like another beautiful day in the neighborhood became, from a playground, we turned into a fortress. And the thing that, along with that experience of hearing the bees that weren't the bees, that really stuck in my head was coming out of the house, I guess it was a couple of hours later, and finding that the pavement outside the house was gone. So literally, the ground beneath our feet had been taken away, and now it was sand. So there was sand, and I didn't know that's what was underneath this particular pavement. I also couldn't work out how the bejesus had this been lifted in the last, suddenly picks and shovels and all sorts of things. Anyway, all these paving stones were now up at the end of the street forming a barricade, and so we were now living in a fortress, and we had to sign in and out of the street. So it was, I suppose, as I was writing this, it became, in a way, the sort of story of the, or at least begun with the last day of your childhood.
So you were 9 years old when this happened.
Mm-hmm.
What did something happen that made you decide 50 years later, now is the time to revisit my own story? And also, in so doing, did you find it painful, cathartic? What was that process like for you?
I think probably all of the above. I mean, it was really being sent back at the beginning of this pandemic to the feeling of uncertainty that I felt back then, this sense that all bets were off. When this was being written, we didn't have a vaccine. We didn't know whether we would all be going back to work. We were separated from the tactile touch of the majority of our loved ones, and so, you know, it was hard to know how you would navigate the future. And so that's why I think it became the catalyst for something that had been preoccupying me. It's a long time to preoccupy you, 50 years, but I didn't really know how to write about it. And then I realized, you know what, the family's never spoken about it. It was something that, you know, I think my parents had to feel, well, first of all, that they had, part of the Northern Irish DNA was that you don't complain, you don't indulge. It's a sort of rather sort of Calvinist, slightly life-denying, rather like that preacher that you see in the movie, if you've seen it, who literally put the fear of God in me, it was something where subsequently we couldn't ever characterize what had happened to us as anything more or important than anybody else. So there was also the desire to make the sacrifice of moving away to England work and believe in it. But I think I wanted to try and understand the sacrifice that my parents made. Many parents in that part of the world did. Many parents do every day of the year, everywhere, all over the world, for their kids. And they do so from, you know, their own flawed human position. So they didn't arrive with the guidebook to, you know, the perfect parenting. And so somehow to be able to go back, I felt at this time, was also partly to understand what were the coping mechanisms. How did you find a way to laugh in dark times? What did you go to musically? We were full of ad hoc parties, you know, and also being Ireland, it rained a lot, so if you could get out at all, you got out onto the street, even when the street was now enmeshed with barbed wire. So some of it was to just go back and discover that, but also really to sort of shake hands with who you are, who you were, and how those two things still exist. And so my creative DNA is in this film. In a way, it's acknowledged in a way that I think maybe surprised some people, but a good reminder to myself as well that you know, you have this association. I'm very lucky to have an association with the works of William Shakespeare. That's always been much that has offered sort of unconditional love artistically, and I've been grateful for it. But it couldn't be further away from my background. You know, I was not born with a big, thick volume of Shakespeare and a pair of tights and a fluffy white shirt. I was in a big theatre like this in Belfast watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So not quite Shakespeare, but
reading Thor.
Yeah, and reading Thor. Yeah, yeah, exactly. In fact, the one sort of artistic question mark I had when we were making this, and when we mainly, as you know, if you've seen it, we make it in black and white, but art and entertainment occurs in colour. And when the boy reads the Thor comic, I was very tempted, but it felt like it was one step outside the stylistic thing, but to, you know, kind of pop in with that amazing colour. I mean, in a way it felt, in our part of Belfast, it felt like America was coming to Belfast when you got one of those comics. And there was such a sort of dramatic framing of the comic books. When I came to make that film of Thor, one of the things that I take a secret delight in is that I was much influenced by the way the comics are framed with what we call Dutched angles, so canted angles, often at 45 degrees. So I framed a lot of the movie like that. For me, it was just because that's the way I saw and remembered and experienced comic books. But there was a bit of we had a few previews, and there was a bit of secret online chatter about, oh, is this too weird? You know, and ultimately, I'm sure there were plenty of people who didn't like it. But at one stage, Marvel, with whom I had a great time, and people I liked very much, but even they investigated whether budgetarily they could afford to horizontalize all the shots, and I was thrilled to say it was too expensive.
Even for Marvel. Yes.
Even for Marvel. So not now, it wouldn't be,
right.
but back then we were the third film in the dynamic force that was about to be the multiverse, the Marvel universe.
So you assembled an incredible ensemble of actors for this, and basically these people had the task of playing their director's mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, which I'm sure for them was a tad daunting, but for you it must have been surreal. And I know among the people you cast was Judi Dench, who you've worked with for 35 years, I think a dozen times, who is now once again an Oscar nominee, just always wonderful. And then somebody who I believe you'd never worked with, but who grew up, as I understand it, basically across town, Karen Hines, also nominated for an Oscar, Best Supporting Actor. Just talk about, assembling this group and what it's like to see your family kind of brought to life in that way.
Well, I think one of the tensions that I tried to navigate was that I didn't want the film to be, as it were, one that I should really just make for me and my therapist. I wanted it to be a film that, here we are in Santa Barbara, and I wanted it to go out into the world. So one of the things, I didn't actively discourage, but I didn't really encourage any questioning encyclopedically about my own family. It started with Jamie Dornan when we started to get together. He started to ask me about my father's betting habits, and I said, well, I can tell you a little bit about that. But what about your dad? Perhaps you'd like to tell me a little about him. And so I turned the question around with genuine interest, because I wanted them to own the parts. And for me, it wasn't about a slavish recreation of what I'd been through, but an inspiration. And so, Kieran Hines and Jamie are both from Belfast. Kieran lived less than a mile from me, across the park, a park in which there is now a wall that divides the Catholics and Protestants. Unbelievable still, isn't it, after all this time, but it's there. And Kieran would have been on the Catholic side of that wall. But he knew, and Jamie knew, the world of those men well. And Judi Dench, who would be a remarkable person in any walk of life. It's just a great gift to us that she happens to be an actor, because we see that sort of big heart and soul and intelligence come to so many memorable performances. But her parents were from Dublin, and she had very emotional memories of going back there for the first time. And she had an uncle from Belfast as well, who made a big impression on her as a kid. So we started with rehearsals that tried to just create a bit of shared experience. In the film, she reads a journal called The People's Friend. My granny used to read this. It's a quasi-religious journal, so it had a little peppering of good Christian thoughts, but it also had a lot of sort of Mills and Boon stories, very romantic stories, usually involving, in the case of what we did in rehearsal, we asked Kieran, because Judy's eyes aren't good enough to read said journal, we asked Kieran to read one of the stories, one of the romantic stories from The People's Friend to Judy, so that she could understand what it was her character was affected by. And that became a beautiful thing, because Kieran Hines finished, walked out of the room, and she just went, I love him. I love him. So he's got a very soulful and magnetic presence, Kieran, and that bit of shared experience was very good. We played football, we played games, and suddenly it was about family. It wasn't about my family, it was about family. And it was about a lot of families, a lot of people. Katrina Balfe grew up on the border between the south and the north of Ireland, very volatile, very aware of how instantly the atmosphere could change and how quickly violence could break out. Jamie Dornan said that when he brought girlfriends back to Belfast when he was in his late teens, early 20s, they'd hear a noise and say to him, oh, a car has just misfired. And he'd say, no, that's a bomb going off. And they'd say, don't be ridiculous. He said, let's switch the television on. And then 10 minutes later, you'd get a report about the bomb that just went off. And so they knew that feeling of being under that kind of tension. And again, because we knew that alas and alack, that would be something that many people in the world would understand. They understand it right now. That that quality of the story, hopefully heading into a direction that meant more things to more people, was where I wanted to go.
When you are making a film and are in need of a great actor, technically you don't have to go very far. You have stepped into a few of your films over the years and been quite wonderful. Was there ever any point where you thought perhaps there was a part that you could have played in this?
Funny you should say that. There was one version of the film where Buddy returned to Belfast, so there was an actor playing older Buddy. I'll give you 3 guesses who did that. He was cheap, he was available, he was very near. But in the end, we shot a sequence of Buddy returning. It didn't seem to work, didn't seem to belong, so it was no longer in, and I didn't have to write, which I sometimes do, that letter to an actor saying, it's me, it's not you, it's me. I thought, I'll bugger him, I'm not going to even bother.
Right. Why do you think an 86-minute film, I believe, or 96-minute film, very economically made, a film about a street in Belfast, has resonated so much with people all around the world? I've seen it numerous times with audiences. They are jumping out of their seats when they see the everlasting love number. They are pulling out tissues at the end. And just, it's an unusually emotional experience for people. And I wonder what you attribute that to.
Well, one thing that I've noticed is certainly that people come up to me afterwards with many stories of their own childhood, many examples of the moment in their lives when, whatever you'd like to call it, innocence is met with enforced adult experience that they may or may not be ready for. So they remember that crossover point, that transitional point that we see Buddy go through in this film very well. And a lot of people have spoken very honestly to me about their own experiences. I think the same applies to the experience of families making difficult decisions that to the larger world may seem very sort of insignificant. Who cares? You've got to move to Belfast, England, whatever. But of course, in your own family, it's a massive, massive, massive one from which you'll always be affected by it. So I think people just essentially put themselves in the story. That's what I have found. What's been particularly moving is that a lot of people who have had to move from very, very difficult situations, people from Haiti, the Congo, Iran. I've met people from all of those countries who had to leave under very, very difficult circumstances and who've simply said to me, that's my story. So that migrant element of it, I think, the migrant story element of it seems to be something that finds a lot of resonance with certain people, yeah.
Finally, just very briefly, did you ever reconnect with the young lady?
I didn't. Well, of course, fortunately, I was very lucky because my wife's in the audience tonight, so I got to meet her much later on, and so I was very, very, very fortunate in that regard. However, my 9-year-old self, was fairly convinced that she was going to fall for the maths guy, and I think that's what happened. But I remember I did stand outside that. I did stand across the street, and she never once looked out. Is all I would say. But it was a lovely thing to remember. But I didn't see her again.
Thank you so much for doing this. And
Thank you.
I'm just going to quickly introduce our next segment, and then we'll be very lucky to have you come back. So,
very well.
At this moment, I am going to introduce our final guest remotely, a New Zealand filmmaker who is one of only 7 women ever nominated for the Best Director Oscar, and the only one who has ever been nominated twice. Her first Best Director Oscar nomination came 28 years ago for The Piano, and her second came this year for her take on a 1967 novel by Thomas Savage. and goes along with other nominations for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Picture. Let's take a look at The Power of the Dog from Jane Campion.